back to another episode of Paideia today. As always, I am Dr. Bill Friesen, joined here by my colleague and friend, Dr. Scott Masson. And today we have another fascinating writer in front of us, none other than W.H. Auden, one of the most significant writers of the 20th century, certainly one of the most significant poets of the 20th century. And usually if we're putting together a list of the great poets of the 20th century, Auden tends to make the short list. You'll find Yeats on there, you'll find Eliot on there, you'll find Auden on there, and then the arguing begins amongst the critics and the scholars as to who else belongs on the list. But Auden almost always makes it onto the list. He is also possibly one of the most popular of the modernist poets that we're going to look at to some extent, because he lived quite late in the period compared to the others, dying in 1973. And moreover, he was active, very active, even in the twilight years of his career. So he was still turning stuff out. And of course, back in sometime in the 90s, his poem was read in the high-profile movie 4 Weddings and a Funeral. And so this also reminded people that the man had existed. Now, Dr. Masson, you have a particular poem, one of his, well, he's got many famous poems. So this is just one of many. It's the Musée de Beaux, if you would.
Why don't you throw the painting up that we're going to look at
Sure. For those who are of our followers who are listeners on podcasts, you won't be able to see this, but I have to go in here. I have to click on that, and then I'll go into screen share. And so it's one of these inter-artistic poems, which speaks to the painting, speaks to mythology. W.H. Auden is an enormously learned and, one hesitates to say, but a very artsy writer, thinker, poet. And so he's continuously referencing the works and the art of the high arts on a regular basis. And this poem is no different. For those of you who can't see, this is Bruegel's Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. And it's a strange painting which caught Auden's attention. There's a man in the foreground going about his day-to-day life, plowing a field behind a big old horse. He himself is not a terribly interesting looking individual, looks late medieval, early Renaissance. Yes. There's a majestic galleon in the background sailing across the sea that clearly has some place to be. And in the foreground, to the bottom, to the right, are little tiny pale white legs dashing into the ocean as Icarus touches down and dies. And nobody seems to want to pay any attention. The shepherd has his back turned to him. The plowman doesn't even look up. The ship is not altering course. There's a fisherman who seems more interested in pulling up the fish rather than the man who is drowning immediately in front of him. The indifference to suffering is epic. Dr. Masson.
Yeah, and Icarus, of course, was trying out his flying machine composed of wax, flew too close to the sun, and for his arrogance, getting too close, dies this death. So that's the reference there. But it's in the museum, the Musée de Beaux, and so that's the title of the poem written in 1940. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who do not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water. And the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on.
Hmm.
So it's a very interesting poem. I used to teach it in my first year course. I've hence in recent years pushed it off the syllabus, not because I don't think it's worthy of time, but there's just only so much you can do on an intro syllabus, and I've pushed other material onto it for various reasons. Some of which we're going to discuss here on Paideia today. But it's interesting. He's talking about the old masters, and here in reference to a painting. So it's a reflection on something that has been presented in a work of art, and at that by a master, Bruegel, and on a classical myth, a little story taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses, the early tales there about how a man um, through art or techne has used human ingenuity and had I'm trying to remember the name of Phaethon, I think. He flies too close to the sun. He's not used to this to the strength of the chariots, and has flown too close and thereby brought down the whole enterprise. So it's saying something about also, I think there's at least a veiled reference to the way in which science or technology can lead to destruction unintended at the hands of nature, which was a theme when we talked about the Titanic as well. And again, this is written in 1940, so something, or published at a rate in 1940, and so there's something about this is at the onset of the Second World War, about the way in which science and technology leads to, despite its hopeful origins, leads to very disastrous outcomes. At the same time, the poem is about how, while the masters observe suffering, the modern world has no place for it and ignores things that are of utmost importance. One of which is the miraculous birth that he mentions there, right in the first stanza. And the fact that there are many who, even in the midst of that miracle, are ignoring that it's even happening, or don't even want it to happen. And he's saying, I think, something about the significance of theological matters. And it's interesting that Auden, for all of the quirks of his personality and his personal life, which we might talk about, and we'll have to talk about to some extent, professed to be a Christian. And I think, and as he grew older, became more orthodox in his Christianity. But again, those are also things to discuss here. But so there's something of a pictorial element here. It is a reflection on the themes that we've already seen in modernism. And at the same time, it's at least bringing to my mind's eye something of the importance of matters that are overlooked. And the fall of Icarus is the preeminent one here. So this incredible event, mythological in its nature, just like the account of the miraculous birth, is ignored, overlooked, and irrelevant, but not in the eyes of the old masters. And I would have thought that Auden purports to, or at least attempts to be one in his own day.
Yes, there's so many things to say about Auden. It's difficult sometimes to know where to begin. He is a writer whose irony and sometimes willful lack of sincerity, his occasional forays into mere political sensationalism, make it very difficult to kind of pin down exactly when he's being sincere and when he's not being sincere. As we saw with T.S. Eliot also, he juxtaposes side by side sincere and ironic representations and voices and things like this. But you can track Eliot a little bit more clearly and verifiably, whereas Auden is to me a continuously moving target in the mist, amidst when you're trying to track down what he's saying. I will say this. I do think that there is a deep, sincere side of Auden, which plays out through his poetry. I'm sure it's there, and I think this poem actually gets at that. He's bothered by the general human indifference to suffering and death. As you say, it's being published in 1940. I think it was written a little bit before this, but I think pretty well everybody who had their finger on any kind of a pulse knew that war and big war was coming.
Oh yeah, by the mid 1930s, it's almost,
Yeah.
everyone sees it's ramping up again.
Yeah, and moreover, they now have the experience of the Great War in view, so they know better what is coming. And there is kind of a blank, bleak weariness of the soul amongst many people as they move up on it. So here we see the death of Icarus, and the world just gets on with its business as if nothing important has happened. Nothing, no one has been lost. Death has not occurred. The birth has not occurred, but that's a bit of a different talking point.
Mm.
And there's a good chance that Auden knew that this was about to happen on a simply massive scale where around you people would die, whole lives would end horribly, and you've just got to carry on as if you were indifferent to it. Maybe you are even indifferent to it, or maybe that indifference is cultivated. We see this horrible example of the martyrdom. The martyrdom is obviously happening slowly because it's at the behest of a torturer, but the horse doesn't care. The dog doesn't care. Life just gets on. And one thing I ask my students when we read this poem together is, there will come a moment when, believe it or not, you will die, young student. And who knows what kind of circumstances that may be. But are you completely okay with the fact that as you're dying in a room outside, somebody might be hurrying by, busy on some mundane errand, and they might even know that you're dying and they can't really be bothered to care? Does that in any way bother you? Does it bother you that you yourself have been indifferent, distracted by the banalities of day-to-day life, preferring the banalities of day-to-day life rather than acknowledging the catastrophic loss of a life in your vicinity, in your ambit somehow? If it doesn't bother you, well, an overwhelming question is why. If it does bother you, well, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to explore it? And I think Auden is exploring something that is a keenly shared reality of the human experience, that our deaths may mean nothing to pretty well everyone around us. Icarus, to also pick up on your point, because I like that point, Icarus, according to the myth, is trapped in the maze with Daedalus, his father.
Right, Douglas.
Daedalus is, in case you don't know, Daedalus is the master artificer of Greek mythology. He is the one who builds the miraculous things. He is a producer of art. And one of his great works of artifice is, as you say, these great wings made out of wax and feathers. And of course, this work of artifice allows them literally to soar up into the heavens. But his son Icarus, as you note, is rather overtaken by the experience, forgets the warnings of his father about flying too close to the sun, his ambition and his hubris, and I don't know, it's been interpreted many ways.
Yep.
Leads him up too high. He's blind to the screams of his father. The wings melt and he tumbles down and dies in the ocean, crashes into the ocean and dies. And since then, the fall of Icarus has come to symbolize for many people the dangers of unrestrained ambition, hubris, call it what you like.
I think it's hubris when it's reflecting here. I think it's reflecting on a cultural. It's a cultural reflection, the unrestrained hubris of the modern age of progress, and the nation state. What that symbolizes, and remember, in the First or the Second World War, the claims of the Nazi Germans are to have a so-called master race, to be on the pinnacle of human achievement, but also of the pinnacle of human nature and so forth. And it's also telling that Joyce, in the portrait of the artist as a young man, his hero is Stephen Dedalus as well. So it seems to me that this figure of Icarus and Daedalus and Techne and art is being presented in literary form, but it symbolizes cultural things, and it's a political, social, cultural commentary as well. So I think you are right. And at the same time, the poem, which you said right at the outset, this is about suffering and the importance and meaning of suffering, which is totally ignored in all of that. And particular types of suffering are sort of marginalized because everyone doesn't experience it the same way. In a sense, it's almost a rejection of the subjectivism that you talked about last time in connection with Eliot. He's trying to find an objective correlative, right? He's trying to find something that is common, rather than, the perspectivalism, which is setting in its teeth now and is leading towards what we're going to call postmodernism, or one of the
Yeah,
features. Yeah.
yeah. Auden is, we've mentioned that he was a Christian and became more Christian, or whatever that might mean, as life went on. And very specifically, he was not just any sort of any stripe of Christian. He was particularly an
Anglo-Catholic,
Anglo-Catholic, yes.
like
And
the smells and bells.
yes, that's an accusation often made of him, and maybe there's something to that. There are a number of other writers who moved in Auden circles at this time, and probably the most significant of these is not Somerset Maugham, Evelyn Waugh.
On the wall. Mm-hmm.
Evelyn Waugh, also Anglo-Catholic. In fact, the two oftentimes are discussed in tandem of one another, Auden and Waugh. Waugh writes very famously the novel Brideshead Revisited, made into a movie sometime in the 90s. But he writes a bunch of other things as well, which are quite significant. So Waugh's not a poet. Auden's the poet, really. Nevertheless, I mentioned the Anglo-Catholic thing because he's going to be, as such, a lot more keenly aware of the role of the martyr, the saint, and religious suffering, or rather the religious component of suffering. And I do think that that's something that really interested Auden pretty well all his life. And here he mentions the martyr explicitly, but of course in a different sense. Icarus, I suppose you could describe him as being martyred. Martyr means witness in ancient Greek, and something is being witnessed to in the fall of Icarus, to be sure. And this is a side of Auden which I think oftentimes is missed by modern critics, modern professors, modern readers of his work, is that there is a significant religious Anglo-Catholic component swimming just underneath the murky waters that are his poetry. And another question I have for my students at this point, with that in view, is that what exactly is the disaster we're exploring here in the Musée des Beaux-Arts? Is it the actual fall of Icarus? Is it the disaster? Is that the tragedy? Or is our indifference to the tragedy the tragedy?
And the painting.
Yeah, in the painting and indeed in the poem, because the poem is exploring this vast indifference. No one cares about suffering, your suffering. Why should they in this world in which we find ourselves? And indeed, have they ever cared about your suffering? Do you ever really care about others' suffering? And do you care? And if you do care, from what perspective? Is it an intellectual one, social one, religious one, emotional? What exactly is that? Have you ever even bothered to explore that in your thinking? Most people, sadly, I suspect, have not, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And he is a sharp critic of some of the fashionable philosophies of his day. So the materialism of many of his contemporaries he just regards as absurd and self-defeating. It's anti-intellectual, really.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, he really wants to avoid spiritualizing that has no sense of the importance of the human body and human suffering. And that's flagged up in this poem, the importance of suffering. The reason that suffering has importance and meaning is really, at least for a Christian, because of the suffering of Christ and the atonement there. Now, he, as I say, we're not going to get our theology from Auden, but he does seem to me, at least on the level of the incarnation, to see the significance here, the spiritual significance of bodily suffering. And that is rooted in, first of all, the birth of God as a man, and then secondly in his propitiatory death on the cross. So the Anglo-Catholic rituals, which he loves, I think have a deep sort of symbolism for him, and rites. You've talked about it being unclear how sincere he is, and I think that's probably fair, because he contradicts himself so regularly in some ways. But there is still a sense that there's a depth here that at least leans in the direction of sincerity. He thinks that sincerity is important. I'm not sure he really is sincere all the time.
No, well, this is what I both like and dislike about Beaux. One of many things I like and dislike about Auden. Auden never stops exploring ideas, positions, perspectives, and stuff like this. And one of the things that this means is that sometimes he knows that he doesn't know, and he's interested, but he's not certain yet on many issues, the important issues that he talks about in his poetry. And that lends a speculative air to many of the things he says. And this is, I think, partly where some of the irony and campiness can come from with his work. So, you know, he's willing to change views. He's willing to change perspectives. He's, you know, you can actually have a real living debate with a guy like Auden, because he knows that certain things are up for debate. But I also believe that, you know, especially at the emotional level, he was a very sincere person. He cares. This is one of the things I'll say also about George Orwell. You know, I disagree on pretty well every talking point when it comes to worldview with George Orwell, when it comes to religion, when it comes to certain social obligations, when it comes to his politics, and so on and so forth. But I believe that the character of the man himself, the way he actually lived his life, and the kind of poetry, or not poetry, the kind of writing that was a product thereof, also highlights the integrity of the man. So I like the man, even if I disagree with pretty well all of his views. I would probably respond in a more qualified and complex sense to Auden. I disagree with Auden about any range of things, but nevertheless, I think that there's a deep, sincere concern for his fellow mankind that draws me to his writing again and again. And it's said that in his writing, for instance, when we're talking about politics, Auden was left, and then at times extremely deeply left-wing, full-on communist at one point in his life, and advocating for communist notions and ideas and what have you. But it has been said by his contemporary, and then especially by later critics, that though his socialist views may have convinced many others, Auden himself remained, at the end of the day, unconvinced by his own views. And I think that that's true. I think at the end of the day, his skepticism got the better of him when it came to his socialist perspectives on any range of things.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
no, so there's almost a posing, intellectual posing, which I think is what you don't like about him. And I share that. There's a sense that he, for all of his willingness to explore these matters and all sorts of matters of depth, and not to dismiss them as absurd and silly and trivial and unworthy of an intellectual. So the matters of the Christian faith. At the same time, he doesn't really get into them to the point where he holds them. So we just talked about this importance of suffering to him, but he doesn't seem to go beyond that to see the importance of the resurrection itself, which is there's the suffering in itself, I would say, is not particularly meaningful in and of itself, unless he is raised from the dead, at which point then the one who experienced the suffering is also able to understand our suffering and to intercede on our behalf as the one who's overcome the sin and death. And he doesn't hold that view. So again, how deeply can you understand suffering and find it meaningful, even in reference to Christ, without understanding the fact that he's overcome that death? So again, it's leaning in the right direction, but he doesn't get there.
yeah, Auden is one of these, by now our listeners will recognize this as a type historically. He's one of these writers who was convicted, though not very effectively, by his own beliefs, religious and otherwise. He considered himself a sinner and regretted certain aspects which he himself defined as sin. We were talking a couple podcasts ago about Baudelaire. And Baudelaire despaired of his soul. He believed his soul was aimed at hell. Auden wouldn't take it that far. Auden mentioned, especially later in life, that he had much to atone for, and that it did no good him pretending that he had not done the sin. He had, and he admitted it. And then as to what aspect he was contrite about that and repented of that, I don't know. That's Auden's private life. And who can say? And we can say this actually, there's a set of these kind of mid-range British writers running through the middle of the 20th century who almost fly beneath a lot of radars. So Auden is oftentimes one of these characters. I've already mentioned Evelyn Waugh. He's another one of these characters. There's another one who I haven't mentioned, another Anglo-Catholic, Somerset Maugham,
Yes.
who sometimes writes popular stuff, sometimes writes what you and I would describe as high art, high literature. And then the last one in the list, in my view, is Graham Greene.
Oh, yeah.
Also a man with
Catholic.
Catholic convictions. I mean, this is like, you're seeing this, there's a pattern here: Anglo-Catholic, 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 and the list just carries on like this.
Yeah, not Orthodox, any of them particularly, and
No.
and not too bothered by that, to the point where at least they are pushed to either accept or reject it. They just are fashionable in being willing, or fashionable and being willing to be connected with Christianity in a way that will gain them some opprobrium from the masses, and so they're happy to be outsiders in a sense, defending a tradition that they themselves don't truly belong to. At least that's my sense. So they are willing to pick up on fashionable causes, and let's talk a little bit about, without getting into lurid detail, about his personal life, his homosexuality, and so forth, which Auden was. He was briefly married, I believe, but more or less in order to help a woman get British citizenship. But I think that was just a brief dalliance. In general, he had homosexual relationships and so forth. But that was, to some degree, I mean, it seemed to be a fashionable thing at the time. It was, and we don't get that in contemporary culture, where the political causes want to talk about the terrible suffering of the gay people in the past, and so forth. But at the time, these were celebrated writers who were known for their homosexuality. These were known quantities in that sense, and they liked being disliked on that front, or questioned on that front. It was a badge of honor, as it were. And I think Auden himself liked that opprobrium to some degree. And so that's what I mean by fashionable. I'm not saying that he wasn't attracted to men or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I just don't think he would have regarded it as an identity per se. Sort of the terminology used today, I think he would find absurd. And it would lose some of the appeal if it were publicly accepted in the way that we speak of it now for him. Do you
Yeah,
think, am I right on this? I don't know.
I get the sense. I mean, there's kind of a, if you read enough 20th century British writers, both poets and novelists, they tend to be a species that really flourishes in the middle of the century, anywhere from the 1920s right through to about the 1950s.
Yep.
They're British. They tend to be often Anglo-Catholic. They tend to have leanings, if not explicit, homosexual identities. Auden's homosexuality was not hidden. He talked about it on numerous occasions, sometimes relatively publicly, when it was definitely dangerous and edgy to do so. And I think, following on from the sort of edginess of the symbolists and then the aesthetes, this is a natural kind of a progression. It's almost predictable in some senses. It's one of the ways in which you foster that edginess, the dangerous artist, the dangerous intellectual, and that kind of thing. Likewise, perhaps to a lesser extent, the Anglo-Catholicism, but I'm not so sure on that front. These writers tend to be people who belong to what we would perhaps not quite accurately describe as aristocrats. They love the good life, the fine life of culture, a high culture, fine dining, afternoons at the National Gallery, the little carefully observed points of etiquette and protocol that seem to be a code amongst that social set. They tend to all know each other. They talk about
He's
each
very
other.
much of a social elite. I mean, he went to Christ Church, Oxford.
Yeah.
This is the wealthiest and most impressive of the Oxford colleges in many ways.
Yeah. So another thing I tend to tell my students about Auden is that, yeah, he was definitely there's another aspect of the identity. They all tend to be left-leaning, with the exception of Evelyn Waugh. Graham Greene, in fact, was suspected of being a KGB spy, probably with good reason. It was never proven decisively, but not a significant KGB spy, but nevertheless, he was an informant, we think. So deep left-wing leanings. That also tends to be an identifying mark. But what I tell my students is that when you run into somebody like Orwell, he's a dyed-in-the-wool socialist, absolutely, a militant socialist. At the end of his days, he's quote unquote a democratic socialist, to use his own phrase, but nevertheless, he's still very much a dyed-in-the-wool socialist, as is Auden. But Orwell is a socialist from amongst the masses. He's a man of the people. He's lived with them pretty well all his lives. He's lived a very austere life. You cannot say that Orwell lived this good aristocratic life at any point. He had no contact with these people whatsoever. His was a different world, and yet he's a socialist. He's the guy who lives with coal miners and stuff like this for years. He lives homeless for many years. A lot of people don't know that about Orwell. He was essentially a hobo for many years, and nobody could get in contact with him because we don't really know where he is. He's out wandering the roads and hitchhiking and jumping trains and stuff like this.
Yeah.
You couldn't come from a more different world when you're coming from Auden's world.
True.
That is the other side of the entire planet as far as social conventions, artistic and cultural conventions are concerned. And Auden always identified very, very deeply with that aristocratic world, even as he was a socialist. This is what causes a lot of critics nowadays to sneer at Auden's socialism, because
the champagne socialist.
Yeah, he's a quote unquote privileged, an enormously privileged man of the people. Oh, are you really? I somewhat doubt it. So it's a lot of people say, again, he's a poser. He's not the real deal. If he was, he would have gotten rid of this life and lived amongst the proletariat, and instead of the scathingly bourgeois.
And that tendency has come to dominate academia since that time, and I don't think it's ever gone away. It's remained fashionable to be politically far on the left and to take up causes for, homosexuality or whatever, to indulge in it possibly. But this is almost like a part of your party membership, that you have to be on board with that in order to be a part of the elite. And it is almost an aesthetic appeal.
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, I think you're right, Scott. There's kind of a strange but consistent blend of qualities here, kind of an artsy, edgy, sexual. I don't want to call that a snob appeal quite, but it's getting pretty close. These are markers that you belong to a certain circle. And
well, I had friends who would be very happy to wear that and say, "Oh yes, indeed I am superior," and so forth, and then there'd be a good laugh.
It's not like this is the kind of thing that is particularly hidden and Byzantine information. This is there for the world to see. And another way to get your brain around the kind of identity and life to which Auden aspired, while Avery Brideshead revisited and sort of taken that entire cultural worldview there, that'll give you a very good idea indeed. But another way to think about this is by comparing Auden and Eliot as thinkers and as men of letters. Eliot is enormously erudite at the level of culture, i.e., he knows the great conversation inside out. He's thought long and deeply about it and its numerous facets, and he thinks about them. Auden, on the other hand, can also be described as enormously cultured, knows a lot of the same information from the great conversation and the trajectory of history and culture, because he's, like I said, he's enormously well educated, no doubt about it. But he's there to enjoy that world. He swims in it. He lives in it. He's, it makes up his day-to-day routines and stuff like this. Whereas T.S. Eliot is engaged very much as a thinking man and an artist with the same sorts of material. You can't imagine, I mean, I don't know anything about this firsthand, and if any of our listeners do, I'd be happy to hear. You can't imagine that T.S. Eliot's going to get all wound up and excited about going to a particularly fancy restaurant that is all the talk of the fashionable crowd and what have you. Whereas Auden may well do so. you can see Eliot thinking long and deeply and intricately about a painting that he's looking at, and how this may reflect upon his own oeuvre. But you can't see him getting as aesthetically excited in terms of the experience as an Auden would in seeing the same painting and stuff like this. So in some senses, they're very, very similar men. There are many sort of little points of comparison, but the way they actually live those in their actual lives and turn that into poetry, I think, are very, very different.
Interesting. So there's more of a self-consciousness about Auden, maybe, or
I think so, yeah. And Auden, like all these other writers I've mentioned, Green and Mon and Waugh as well, they tend to be in the type of literature they write. Because, and Somerset Maugham is particularly notable for this, there are times when he's writing short stories and things of that sort, largely for entertainment value and a paycheck, and they're kind of popular. And then there's other times he writes stuff which is definitely high literature. There's no mistaking it. Waugh does the same thing. When you're reading the various works of Evelyn Waugh, you can be forgiven oftentimes for thinking to yourself, am I reading literature or am I reading something popular from the 1930s? Who read this back in the day? And one suspects that it's all stripes. The unwashed masses are reading it, but then probably also some people of more cultured perspectives are also picking it up with some interest. But they're never really, none of these four, in my view, are comfortably all in on high literature and art the way most of the other authors we've been talking about so far in this podcast identify with that sort of thing. There's a question mark that hangs over all four of these.
Is it a reflection of the men? I mean, it obviously is. Or is it a reflection of the culture and what it produces as its finest representatives, and even what it values? Is it a reflection of the 20th century as much as anything?
I think you might have something there. Because one of the upshots of this kind of interstitial between two worlds kind of identity, high art, popular art, is that many of their works are at times refreshingly accessible. You and I were talking about this before we began today, and this is something that you actually appreciate about W.H. Auden, is that he's not being an obscurantist about any of this stuff here. He's not being affected the way many intellectuals, particularly the philosophers and the theorists of the postmodern era, are going to be ridiculously affected using highly specialized tangled jargon and what have you to dress up either toxic or ridiculous ideas. So you don't have that charge oftentimes attaching to Auden. Auden is more accessible in many of his poems. Does that detract from the quality of his poems? That's a going argument. I would argue at times it does, but not always. And also my students tend to, because Auden is so accessible in many of his poems, a lot of my students light up with Auden the way they wouldn't light up with a Yeats or an Eliot.
Yes, and that's been my experience. I think he's easier to, particularly in the short poems of the sort like Musée de Beaux or Epitaph on a Tyrant, or even Funeral Blues, which you mentioned earlier was in Four Weddings and a Funeral, quoted at the end. Very easy to, without any knowledge even, to appreciate. And at the same time, it seems to be saying something that is a little bit unusual and maybe profound. So Epitaph on a Tyrant, it's 6 lines, I'll read it. Perfection of a kind was what he was after. And the poetry he invented was easy to understand. He knew human folly like the back of his hand, and was greatly interested in armies and fleets. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter, and when he cried, the little children died in the streets.
Yeah.
Epitaph on a Tyrant, speaking to some degrees after perfection. Again, this pursuit which we spoke of a few weeks ago on with Conrad, this commitment to not perfection. What was the phrase he used? I can't remember the term that he used for this, but this sort of a thoroughgoing commitment to technique for its own sake, and just this mechanized way of getting outcomes which is really product of the scientific revolution, but it starts to take on legs in this period, and it's a commitment to that and seeing it to the end, which is a mark of totalitarian society. So the tyrant, or the that he's referring to here, you can imagine every tyrant in ages past being marked by this to some degree as well. That when he laughs, everyone else laughs, because he better not be seen not to be on side with the tyrant. And when he cries, the little children die in the streets. You can hear everyone going back from Pharaoh in ancient Egypt to Herod calling for the massacre of the innocents in Christ's day, and on to his contemporaries, Hitler or Stalin or whoever we'd want to refer to here, all having a sort of a poetry, not Auden's sort of poetry, but a type of creativity nonetheless. So it's a really interesting poem, and it's important as a reflection on his own days once again. But is it deep? Is it rich? Not really.
No, it's striking.
It's striking.
And but you know, it's unlike well, here's a marker. Unlike something like The Wastelands or even the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which you can read again and again and again as the years go by.
And it gets richer with each reading.
Yeah. Once you've read Epitaph on a Tyrant, you kind of got it. There it is, and you're kind of done. So part of me wonders whether this lack of, I'm not going to call it artistic depth, cultural depth in some ways, which is sometimes displayed by Auden, not always. He has some poems which I think genuinely bear reading and rereading and rereading again in the same way you can with a poem by T.S. Eliot. But part of me wonders whether or not this is the reason that they are this type of writer in the middle of the century seems so eager to affect a certain demeanor, that sort of aristocratic, snob, artsy appeal and what have you. Are they overcompensating? And this is something that a lot of people have said about Auden throughout the years, that many of the foibles of his poetry comes by way of compensation and defensiveness and stuff like this. He's always got half an eye on the mirror, looking at himself self-consciously, wondering, perhaps, do I belong? Do I not belong? Where do I stand in all of this sort of stuff? There was another thing I wanted to say about the Nazis, but it's gone from my head. Maybe
the fact that he fled England on the onset of their, in 1939.
Yeah, now that's kind of a hot topic, and I think some people have been a little bit uncharitable to Auden on this front.
He offered to go back.
Well, first of all, one of the reasons he left was because his open homosexuality was becoming too much of an embarrassment to his extended family. He regretted that. Like I said, I think at the end of the day, as wrong-headed as he may have been, I think Auden had, for lack of a better phrase, a good heart, and he didn't want to see that happen. So that was part of the reason for why he left. I'm sure there are many other reasons as well. I don't think the coming war was one of them, because he volunteered to go back. He volunteered for the diplomatic service. He attempted to enroll in the American Army, and was rejected on the grounds of his homosexuality. So I don't ever get the sense that the man spoke one thing and thought the opposite. I don't think he was a coward in that respect, and I think some people have very uncharitably painted him as such. I don't think
I agree.
I don't think that's fair. So we have that aspect of him as well. Also, we haven't mentioned it, but as a minor point in passing, he was an enormously heavy drinker all his life.
And smoker.
Yes, and safe to say he was an alcoholic. They can't characterize him any other way. And he probably would tell you as much after his third gin and something. So there was that, and as you say, he was a heavy smoker. If you look at photographs of Auden as an older man, he has a remarkable face. What was the phrase he used to describe it again, Scott?
It's an unmade bed. So you have more wrinkles on that face than I have ever seen on anyone in my life. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and he knew it and was able to laugh at himself, which again makes me like the man somewhat more.
Me too. Yeah.
And I think smoking is a large part of that. Drinking is a large part of that. Having lived, let's
But
call it
again,
a
that's
big,
part of the aristocratic culture, like, right? This is not a working class thing, although everybody smokes at the time, but it's very aristocratic. What's the difference? Well, you stick your cigarette at the end of a holder. That's about it,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
You don't hold it
that's
in your
about it.
grubby little hands. You put it at the end of a holder. So that's about it. You have to
Yeah,
mark
so
yourself out somehow.
yeah, and everybody's stopping by for drinks continuously in this
Sure.
world. So, it's quite natural that this should happen. I'm oftentimes a little bit surprised that the man lived as long as he did, that he died finally in 1973. I think it was at 70 years old.
Something like that. Yeah, he's a tough
Yeah.
old boot.
Yeah, I also like, I mean, as a little bit of a side note, he was fascinated with one of my big areas of interest, which is medieval Icelandic literature.
Yes, I was going to raise that with you.
Yes, he said he was quite influenced by it. I don't see the influences, but maybe I'm missing it. He did give me a handy analogy though, because if anybody here has read Viking literature in any form, you'll know that one of the main topics that comes up again and again, one of the great tragedies that infuses much of this literature is the blood feud, where somebody from your clan kills somebody in their clan, and then they are obligated under the rules of honor to kill one of yours right back. And W.H. Auden coined this analogy, saying it was the only successful invention of a perpetual motion machine that mankind has ever pulled off. Is the Scandinavian, is the Viking. Yeah, so I think Auden is a very complex character. I don't like his poetry as much as I like the poetry of T.S. Eliot. You go the opposite direction. Can you say a little bit about why it is that you prefer Auden? Is it just that he's at times less obscurist and more transparent in what he's driving at?
Pretty much, I don't like, as I said to you, I don't like modernist poetry at all. I don't like the period. I don't find it particularly deep or insightful or meaningful. It's interesting to read as a reflection of the era in which it's written. So it's a period piece, but I don't see it as falling in the broad tram lines of the great tradition and speaking profoundly within that. It has perspectives on it. There's engagement with it for sure, and the authors are without a doubt well read. And the references are there in terms of classical and biblical references. The best writers most surely do that, and so you can't understand them without having a classical education and a biblical knowledge. You simply can't do it. And we're not going to look at Joyce, but you could talk about Joyce. There are countless writers we could speak of in the 20th century who are considered to be substantive and important, that they clearly have that reference and they expect you to read it. So Joyce's Ulysses is obviously about, again, it's written about Achilles, and it takes place, and it's a sort of a patchwork that's playing off of Dante's Divine Comedy and so forth, right? And timeline, all that. So it's a rich, profound engagement in that sense. But still, I am not a fan of the period, and I think that this is less arcane and less, I don't want to say convoluted, but it's less challenging to read, and so it's easier for me to read what is effectively trivial anyway. So I'll take that.
At least he's not being disingenuous about that.
No,
He's writing
no.
about somewhat facile stuff.
Yeah, it's because I'm facile and I like bright, shiny toys.
That's right. And I'm going to present them to you in a spectacular fashion. Ta-da. That's all very nice and sensational. And
There you
now
go.
let's get on with our day.
Yeah.
Retire to the club, cigars and whiskey for all. But actually, what you mentioned here raises another thought, which is that they mention the great tradition, the cultural tradition here, mythology, the great texts of the past, the great ideas of the past, the philosophers, and so on, the theology occasionally. But they mention them almost as affectations many times, I feel. They're not always functionally, logically tying into the ongoing steps of that conversation. They gesture that they know them and that they can reference them in very poised, eloquent ways. but at the really deep functional level, I don't think Auden uses them the way an Eliot or a Tennyson or a Shakespeare uses the talking points of the great conversation. One could say
They don't pervade every aspect of his thought. It's there as a piece. So let's
yeah,
try this now. So he's got a series of Good Friday poems in the same way that Eliot has what did we talk about that the last time? So I'm just drawing a blank, right? Burnt Norton and so forth. Um,
getting four
the
quartets.
four quartets, which I
Mhm.
think are profoundly Christian and deep. And I think it is a reflection of Eliot in that sense. Eliot is a deeper man, and there's more consistency there. There's a trajectory from early days to later, and once he goes down that path, he stays on that path as well. He doesn't flit about, whereas Auden does. So the Good
Yeah,
Friday poems, the Ore Canonicae, I think are actually quite apparently meaningful and good poems, but they stick out, and then he moves away from that again. Well, now
yeah.
let's try the bucolics. Let's talk about the Shield of Achilles and so forth. Go in a different direction. Where's the continuity there?
I would say, and this is going to sound extremely ungenerous now to Auden, so I'm going to have to come back and qualify this a little bit. I would say in many of his poems, his utilization of his magnificent cultural education, and it is magnificent, is on many occasions merely decorative. It's merely decorative. It's not functional. Whereas with many of these other writers from further back, it is functional. I think some of his best work,
That's a good way of putting it.
Auden's best work, I think, oftentimes makes very little to no use of that great tradition. I think something like Spain, 1937, I think that falls into the category of high art. I don't think there's anything glib about that poem at all. Some people got all excited about September 1939, which is another one of his poems. I don't think that's as good a poem as 37. Musée de Beaux Arts, I think, has a lot more merit than Epitaph of a Tyrant. So you got to really pick and choose your Auden. And some of them are, I think, timeless classics and should be acknowledged as such. And others are merely interesting. It's the kind of stuff to pass an idle hour, but it's not really, it can't bear prolonged, deep, introspective study, reading, and contemplation.
Yeah.
Probably one of his most fascinating, striking, and yet glibest poems is The Unknown Citizen. I don't know if you've had a chance to
No,
look at that.
I don't know that one.
It's a little bit longer, but let me just read that one for you, just to give you a sense of the,
While you're looking for that, he does translate in verse the Elder Edda, so that you mentioned the Icelandic legend and of
yes.
interest. So he sticks with that. That's in 1969, towards the end of his life.
Yeah, he's, because I actually know Old Norse, he's a translator who translates. He's not a literal translator, as we say from.
No, he's free. That's right.
He's a meaning for meaning translator rather than a literal translator. And so he, like Seamus Heaney a bit, he
Yeah.
has his own agenda,
Yeah.
and he puts that to the foreground. Unknown Citizen. Here we have it.
Yeah, I don't like the style of translation either, by the way.
Magnusson is your go-to for a good, strong, literal translation of most Icelandic works. The Unknown Citizen. This marble monument is erected by the state. And then it begins. That's the epigraph that they have over there. He was found by the Bureau of Statistics to be one against whom there was no official complaint, and all the reports on his conduct agree that, in the modern sense of an old-fashioned word, he was a saint. For in everything he did, he served the greater community. Except for war, till the day he retired, he worked in a factory and never got fired, but satisfied his employer, Fudge Motors, Inc., yet he wasn't a scab or odd in his views, for his union reports that he paid his dues. A report on his union shows it was sound. And our social psychology workers found that he was popular with his mates and liked to drink. The press are convinced that he bought a paper every day and that his reactions to advertisements were normal in every way. Policies taken out in his name proved that he was fully insured, and his health card shows he was once in hospital but left it cured. Both producers' research and high-grade living declare he was fully sensible to the advantages of the installment plan and had every necessity to the modern man: a phonograph, a radio, a car, a Frigidaire, Our researchers into public opinion are content that he held the proper opinions for the proper time of year. When there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. He was married and added 5 children to the population, which our eugenist says is the right number for a parent of his generation. Our teachers report that he never interfered with their education. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should certainly have heard. So it's entertaining stuff. It might seem at first glance to have something profound, at least towards the end. But really at the end of the day, it's, you know, and Tennyson lamented that he also wrote stuff like this back in his day when he was poet laureate. There was stuff for popular consumption, and then there was the really serious stuff. And he made a distinction between them. So maybe Auden's doing the same thing. And if so, you know, Pax, we're good. I should also mention of Auden that he was, as I said, he's a heavy drinker. He was a heavy smoker. He was homosexual. But he considered these things sins and regretted them.
Yeah,
so
that's
we need to keep that in view also. That he wasn't okay with them. He wasn't fine with them. And he didn't have a lot of time for people who told him that he should be fine with such things. He believed in being morally responsible and accountable, at least to himself.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, like most people who are sort of people that other people then study afterwards, there's always a complexity there that people that engage with it find it difficult to say things without being unfair to the person that they're describing, because there is I don't want to say profundity, but there's certainly a complexity about Auden that escapes easy characterization on our part. And certainly that, again, it's unfashionable to even, in our day, nobody even talks about sin, but for him even to speak of such things, or to think in those terms and be genuinely tormented by his actions, such that he has a conscience and so forth. And I find that likable. It makes me trust him more. That you know, he doesn't just indulge in every. When I say indulge, he doesn't make it his conscience to follow everything he does and say that it's good just because he does it.
Yeah. He's not. You can't easily typify him as a relativist, especially as a moral relativist.
No.
He doesn't compute as such, and I've seen professors try to push him into that particular identity, and he's not a good fit.
No.
He struggles against such things, and we also need to remember that particularly by the time we hit the 40s and 50s, talking about your own art and your own conduct in terms of sin, especially from an explicitly Christian perspective, is already deeply unfashionable in intellectual and arts.
Oh gosh, yes.
They had, by the time we reached World War II, it's safe to say that modern culture had comfortably, solidly, and decisively moved beyond good and evil.
In Britain.
In Britain and
Europe.
in many places in the world. I mean, this is the rise of the Nazis are essentially your big historical marker for that. You can't accuse them of being good or evil. They won't understand that language, and they don't care. They've got the guns, and that's really the only argument today that's going to matter. Which, by the way, is a sort of a motif picked up on by that poem, Spain, 1937.
Yeah.
Yesterday, all these things, but today. Yesterday, all these things, but today. It's a very liturgical beat to that poem. Very interesting. Is there something more you wanted to say about?
Not really. I thought he deserved to be treated, if we're going to look at the 20th century and the rise of modernism and then modernism. I wanted Auden to be amongst them. I have explained why I think that he's worth reading, and also why I don't think that he can hold a candle to some of the authors that we looked at earlier in Paideia today. But then that might be, again, because he's a product of the era that he is coming from, that there's a decadence that is set in. Is it exacerbated by the 2 world wars? Most certainly. There's a weariness there, but at the same time, he is quailed by conscience, and does engage with some of the, at least some of the, certainly the texts and some of the main ideas that we've seen throughout, and I thought he was worthy of including on the course.
Yeah.
Just like Yeats, who we'll look at next time.
Yeah. This is maybe another thing we should mention before we leave him behind. Him continuously referencing not just history, but cultural history, the myth of Icarus, the Bruegel, the whatever, is increasingly also a rare tendency amongst writers of his day. Remember that the modernists, well, one of the ways I differentiate the postmodernists from the modernists is that the modernists are intensely hostile to tradition and history. They don't like it. They savage it at every turn, most of them, with a few happy exceptions, Auden, Eliot, maybe in his own weird way, Yeats. You mentioned Joyce as well. But this is increasingly rare. And we're going to see that instead of hating history, the postmodernists in the next phase have actually forgotten that it even exists or that it's in any way even relevant. They can't even be bothered to vilify it if they know its salient points even exist, which many
and want to make sure that everybody else does as well.
Yeah, collective amnesia about cultural history is something that marks out the postmodernists like few other tendencies. You want to see an identifying feature? There's a big one right there, I would argue.
Good point.
Good. Now, as you say, we're going to be looking at the last of the big three poets of the 20th century, at least according to you and I, but I think we're in pretty good company with a lot of critics on this one here. W.B. Yeats, fascinating Irish poet, seen as one of the greatest figures in Irish literature ever to have written. And he's going to require a fair bit of treatment as well, because like Eliot and like Auden, he is a complex creature. And many different phases in his life where he is a radically different writer from phase to phase to phase.
Yes.
So he's also endlessly fascinating.
Yeah. But we will look at that next time. W.B. Yeats, once again. We'll do a few of his different poems. But that's it for today. I'm Scott Masson here with my esteemed friend and colleague, Bill Friesen, and we'll see you next time on Paideia Today. See you then.
Good reading, folks. Take care.
Bye.